My husband's here somewhere. I told him to sit in the back and not embarrass me tonight.
Wait, that's Sterling. That's our CEO.
She doesn't bring anyone to these. Ever.
然後嘅，所謂我送阿伯嘅送大嘅禮物。
How is this possible?
The text came in at 6:42 on a Friday evening, while I had epoxy resin drying under my fingernails and a 200-year-old jewelry box open on my workbench. Lyra, don't forget my promotion gala tonight. Try to look presentable for once, and sit at the back table. I don't need you making small talk with anyone important. I read it twice, then a third time just to make sure I wasn't imagining the casual cruelty of it. 6 years of marriage, and my wife had just invited me to her biggest career moment the way you'd invite a stray dog to stay outside during a dinner party. I should tell you who I am, quickly, because it matters for what happens next. My name is Julian Voss. I restore antiques for a living, old clocks, damaged paintings, forgotten heirlooms that people bring to my small workshop because nobody else has the patience to fix them. It's not glamorous work. It doesn't come with a corner office or a name on a building. Lyra used to find that romantic, back when we were 24 and broke and in love. Now she found it embarrassing. I set down the tiny brush I'd been using and stared at the message for a long moment. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I laughed. Because 3 weeks earlier my entire life had quietly cracked open, and Lyra had no idea. Let me back up just slightly, though I promise I won't linger here. You'll get the full story soon enough. 3 weeks ago, a woman walked into my workshop holding a tarnished silver locket. She said she'd found it in a box of things salvaged from a car accident more than 10 years old, and she wanted to know if it could be restored. The moment I took it from her hands, something in my chest turned over like a key finding its lock. Her name was Serafina Sterling, and I hadn't seen her since the night I thought I'd lost her forever. I won't explain everything now. What matters is this. Serafina wasn't just someone from my past. She was the CEO of Marchetti & Hale, the same design and architecture firm where Lyra worked. The same firm throwing tonight's executive promotion gala. The same gala Lyra had just texted me about, like I was an afterthought she was legally required to invite. Lyra didn't know that. Lyra didn't know anything. I looked down at my hands, calloused and stained, and I thought about the back table. The one Lyra imagined me sitting at all night, nursing a drink, saying nothing, embarrassing no one, invisible, exactly the way she liked me. Then I picked up my phone and called Serafina. She invited me, I said when she answered. As a joke, basically, wants me in the back corner. There was a pause on the line, and then I heard something in Serafina's voice that hadn't been there in over a decade. A low, amused warmth, like sunlight breaking through old clouds. Then let's make sure she remembers this gala for the rest of her life, she said. Wear the navy suit. I'll send the car at 7. The estate where Marchetti & Hale held their gala wasn't just a venue, it was a statement. Wrought iron gates, manicured hedges lit gold from below, a driveway lined with luxury cars belonging to people who'd spent their whole careers trying to get invited to nights like this one. I'd been to exactly 0 events like it in my life. 6 months ago, walking up those front steps would have made my hands shake. Tonight, they didn't shake at all. The vintage limousine pulled up to the entrance a few minutes past 8, deliberately late. Serafina's idea, not mine. Entrances matter, she'd told me in the car, adjusting the cufflink on my sleeve with the same careful, familiar touch she used to have when we were 23 and inseparable. People remember who walks in last. The driver opened the door. I stepped out first, buttoning my jacket, and then I turned and offered my hand. Serafina Sterling emerged in a deep emerald gown that seemed to catch every bit of light on that driveway and throw it back tenfold. She was 51 years old and carried herself like she'd built the world she was standing in, which, in a very real sense, she had. She took my hand like it was the most natural thing on earth, like we'd done this 100 times before, at 100 parties, in another life that had been stolen from both of us and was only now being handed back. We walked toward the ballroom doors together. I felt the shift before I even saw it, a kind of electricity rippling backward through the crowd near the entrance, whispers passing from one cluster of expensive suits to the next. Is that? No, it can't be. Sterling doesn't attend these with anyone. Who is he? The double doors opened, and we stepped through as a couple. The room did not just quiet down, it stopped. 300 of the city's most powerful executives, investors, and rising stars froze, mid-conversation, mid-sip, mid-laugh, their eyes locking onto the woman who never brought a +1 to anything, arriving on the arm of a man in a simple navy suit that cost less than the flowers on a single table. And then I found her. Lyra stood near the center of the room in a stunning silver dress, mid-toast, champagne glass raised high, her face glowing with the kind of triumphant, self-satisfied joy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. She was laughing at something, saying my name. I could see it on her lips, some punchline about her husband being too plain, too boring, too nothing to matter here tonight. Her eyes drifted toward the doors out of habit, and landed on me. The champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the sound cutting through the stunned silence like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned toward her. Lyra's triumphant smile didn't fade slowly, it collapsed all at once, like a building with its foundation pulled out from underneath it. Her mouth opened, no sound came out. I held Serafina Sterling's hand a little tighter, and together we walked into the room. 3 weeks before that ballroom went silent, my workshop smelled like sawdust, linseed oil, and the particular mustiness of things that had been forgotten for a very long time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow and unremarkable, the kind of day where the biggest event was usually a delivery van double-parked outside. Then the bell above my door chimed, and everything I thought I understood about my own life quietly began to unravel. I didn't look up right away. I was hunched over a 19th century mantel clock, coaxing a stubborn gear back into place. "Be right with you," I called out, the way I always did. "Take your time," a voice answered. I froze, not because the voice was unfamiliar, because it was the opposite. It was a voice I had spent 10 years training myself to stop hearing in my memory. And hearing it again, unguarded, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, felt like being struck by something I couldn't name. I set down my tools and looked up. She was older, obviously, the way all of us are older after a decade, but it was unmistakably her. Serafina Sterling stood in my doorway wearing a tailored charcoal coat, her dark hair threaded with the first elegant strands of grey, her expression polite and slightly formal, the way you'd greet a stranger. Because to her, in that moment, I was one. "I'm sorry to just show up," she said, stepping further inside, glancing around at the shelves of half-restored treasures. "Someone recommended your workshop. I have a piece I'd like restored if you have the time." She didn't recognize me. I understood in that instant, with a kind of quiet devastation, exactly what had happened to her. I'd heard about the accident years ago, through mutual friends who'd slowly drifted away from me after Serafina disappeared from my life. A car crash on a rain-soaked highway. A head injury severe enough to steal years of memory. I'd tried to see her in the hospital. Her family had turned me away, told me she didn't know who I was, and that seeing me would only confuse and upset her further. I was 26 years old, and I'd had to accept that the woman I loved had woken up in a world where I simply didn't exist. So I'd buried it. Buried the plans we'd made, the little art restoration studio we were going to build together, the promise we'd whispered to each other on the coast the summer before the accident, that no matter what happened, we'd spend our lives creating something meaningful, side by side. I buried all of it, because grief for someone who's still alive but doesn't remember you is its own particular kind of hell, and the only way through it was to stop looking back. And now she was standing in my workshop, 10 years later, holding out a small velvet box like she had no idea she was handing me my entire past. "Of course," I managed to say. "What do you have?" She opened the box, and inside, resting on faded velvet, was a tarnished silver locket. I recognized it instantly. I'd bought it for her myself, engraved with our initials on the inside, a gift for our 3rd anniversary of dating. She'd worn it every single day until the accident. "It was recovered from the wreckage," she explained, watching my face carefully, maybe sensing something in my expression she couldn't quite place. "My family kept it, but no one ever knew what to do with it. I found it in storage a few months ago, going through old boxes. I don't remember where it came from exactly, but I felt like I needed to fix it." I took the locket from her hands, and the moment my fingers closed around the cool, familiar metal, my throat tightened so hard I could barely speak. "I can restore this," I said quietly. "It'll take a few days." She thanked me, left her contact information, and walked out of my shop like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. I sat there for a long time after she left, turning that locket over and over in my hands, feeling 10 years of buried grief claw its way back up to the surface. She came back 4 days later to collect it. I'd cleaned the tarnish, repaired the tiny clasp, polished the engraving until our initials gleamed again, J, V, and SS, intertwined. When I placed it in her palm and she saw the engraving clearly for the first time, something shifted behind her eyes. She went very still, staring down at the initials like they were trying to tell her something her own mind refused to translate. "JV," she whispered. "That's you. Julian." My heart stopped. "I don't..." She pressed a hand to her temple, breathing unevenly. "I don't understand. I don't know how I know that." Over the next hour, sitting together in my cluttered workshop, fragments came back to her in pieces, disjointed, emotional, incomplete, but unmistakably real. A summer on the coast, a promise about building something together, my hands teaching hers how to carefully clean an old canvas, the specific sound of my laugh. By the time she left that evening, she wasn't remembering everything, but she was remembering enough. Enough to know that the life she'd built without me had a hole in it she'd never been able to explain. A persistent, aching absence she'd simply learned to live around, the way you learn to walk with a permanent limp. 2 days later, she called me. "I want you there," she said, without any preamble. "At my company's gala, not hiding in the back, standing beside me. We made a promise once, and I think some part of me has been trying to keep it for 10 years without even knowing why." I should have told her then that I was married, that my life had moved on in ways that were complicated and messy and far from the plans we'd made as 23-year-olds in love. But some promises, I was learning, don't actually die. They just wait. For a moment, nobody in that ballroom moved. 300 guests stood frozen around shattered champagne glass and the wreckage of Lyra's perfect night, waiting to see what would happen next. Lyra recovered first, the way she always did. I'd seen her do it 100 times in 6 years of marriage, take a devastating blow and, within seconds, rearrange her face into something resembling composure. She crossed the ballroom floor toward us, heels clicking sharply against marble, her silver dress catching the chandelier light with every furious step. "Julian." She said my name like an accusation. "What is this? What are you doing?" "You invited me," I said calmly. "I'm here." Her eyes darted to Serafina, to our joined hands, and something like panic flickered across her face before she buried it under a brittle, performative laugh. She turned to the gathering crowd, raising her voice just enough to be heard by the nearest tables. "I'm so sorry, everyone. My husband has a wonderful sense of humor." She reached for my arm, her nails digging in through my sleeve. "Excuse us for just a moment." I didn't move. "Let go, Lyra." The crowd was watching now, phones lowering slightly, the kind of hush falling over the room that only happens when people sense they're about to witness something they'll be talking about for months. Lyra felt it too. I watched her calculate, in real time, that pulling me quietly aside was no longer an option. so she went on the attack instead. "You want to know what's really happening here?" she said, loud enough now that there was no pretending otherwise. She gestured at me like I was an exhibit. "This is my husband, a man who fixes broken furniture for a living, and somehow he's shown up tonight on the arm of our CEO. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, playing to the room. "I don't know what he told you, Miss Sterling, but I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with. He's charming, I'll give him that. He's also very good at attaching himself to successful women." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment, but from something closer to disbelief, that after everything this was still her first instinct. Attack, discredit, control the narrative before anyone could question her. Serafina, beside me, hadn't said a single word yet. She simply watched Lyra with the calm, unhurried patience of someone who had sat across boardroom tables from far more dangerous people than an angry junior executive in a silver dress. "Is that so?" Serafina finally said, her voice quiet but carrying effortlessly across the now silent room. "An opportunist? That's an interesting choice of word, Lyra, considering your promotion this year was built on his work." Lyra's confidence cracked visibly. "Excuse me?" "The Halcyon Estate restoration concept," Serafina continued, unhurried, almost conversational. "The one you presented to the board 11 months ago. The hand-rendered structural sketches, the historical material analysis, the entire design philosophy the board specifically praised as a masterclass in blending restoration with modern architecture. That's the project that earned you this promotion tonight, isn't it?" The color drained from Lyra's face. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. Serafina reached into the small clutch at her side and withdrew a folded set of papers, photocopies, slightly worn at the edges. She held them up, not for Lyra, but for the board members standing nearby, several of whom had drifted closer, drawn in by the unfolding scene. "These are pages from Julian's private sketchbook," Serafina said. "Dated 3 years ago. I recognized the handwriting the moment I saw the Halcyon presentation in your firm's portfolio archive last month, Lyra. I didn't say anything then because I wasn't certain of the connection. I am now." She held the papers out, and one of the board members, a silver-haired man I vaguely recognized as the firm's founding partner, stepped forward and took them, scanning the pages with visibly widening eyes. "These sketches predate the Halcyon pitch by 2 years, Serafina said, turning now to address the crowd directly, her CEO voice fully in place, cutting and precise. Every foundational concept in that award-winning presentation, the material choices, the structural philosophy, the entire design language, originated in these private notebooks. Notebooks belonging to a man who has never worked a single day at Marchetti and Hale. The silence that followed was worse than the shattering glass had been. Lyra's mouth opened and closed. Those are just old sketches. They don't prove anything. I developed the actual..." "Lyra." The founding partner's voice was low, and it silenced her instantly. He looked between her and the papers, his expression hardening. "We will be discussing this Monday morning, in my office." Lyra's eyes filled with something between rage and panic as she turned back to me, searching my face for some explanation, some way to undo what had just happened in front of everyone whose opinion she'd spent years desperately curating. "You knew about this," she said to me, voice trembling now. "You let this happen." "I didn't do anything, Lyra," I said quietly. "You did this yourself, years ago. I just never said anything, because I didn't think you'd ever get caught." I felt Serafina's hand tighten gently around mine, steady and grounding, as the whispers around us grew louder, as phones finally began to rise again, as Lyra's carefully built evening, and possibly her entire career, collapsed in real time on the marble floor of that ballroom, right alongside her shattered champagne glass. I didn't go home with Lyra that night. I stayed at the gala another hour with Serafina, speaking quietly with a few board members who approached us, cautious and curious, trying to understand exactly who I was and how much of Lyra's career had been built on borrowed foundations. By the time I finally walked through my own front door, it was past midnight, and every light in the house was on. Lyra was sitting at the kitchen island, her silver dress still on, makeup smeared from crying, an empty wine glass in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "Do you have any idea what you did to me tonight?" she finally said, her voice hoarse. "What I did to you?" I set my keys down slowly on the counter, forcing myself to stay calm. "Lyra, I didn't do anything except show up to something you invited me to." "You know what I mean." She stood up too fast, swaying slightly, gripping the counter for balance. "You brought her. You let her humiliate me in front of my entire board. Do you understand what's going to happen to me now? They're going to review the promotion. They might rescind it. I could lose my job over this, Julian." "You didn't lose your job because I showed up with someone," I said quietly. "You're in trouble because you stole my work and presented it as your own to earn that promotion in the first place." She flinched like I'd struck her, but recovery came fast, the way it always did. "It wasn't stealing. You never even wanted to use those sketches for anything. They were just sitting in a drawer, collecting dust, going nowhere. I turned them into something real. I made them matter. They were mine, Lyra." My voice stayed level, but something in my chest had gone very cold. "You didn't ask. You didn't credit me. You built your entire career trajectory this year off ideas I sketched out privately, and then you spent tonight telling 300 people I was an opportunist attached to a rich woman." She pressed her palms against her eyes, and when she looked up again, her expression had shifted into something softer, more desperate. This was a pattern I recognized instantly, the pivot from anger to pleading, a dance we'd performed many times over 6 years. "Julian, please." She crossed the kitchen toward me, reaching for my hands. "You have to fix this. You know Serafina. You clearly have some kind of relationship with her. I don't even want to know what kind right now. But you have to talk to her. Ask her not to pursue this with the board. Ask her to let it go. For my sake. For our sake." I looked down at her hands wrapped around mine, and something inside me finally, quietly, settled into place. Not anger, not sadness exactly. Clarity. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked. "You're not asking me to forgive you. You're asking me to use my relationship with Serafina to protect the career you built by taking something from me without asking." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant." I pulled my hands back gently. "Lyra, when's the last time you asked me about my work? Not used it, asked about it. When's the last time you came to one of my workshop showings, or asked how a restoration project turned out, or introduced me to anyone at your firm as something other than an afterthought?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, because we both already knew the answer. "I used to think I was patient," I continued, the words coming easier now that I'd finally let myself say them. "I told myself I was being a good husband, giving you space to focus on your career, not needing much attention in return. But sitting in that ballroom tonight, hearing you tell 300 strangers I was some kind of parasite attaching myself to a powerful woman," I shook my head. "That wasn't a slip, Lyra. That was 6 years of how you actually see me, finally said out loud where I could hear it." "That's not fair," she said, tears spilling over now. "I've had a hard year. The pressure at work has been—" "This isn't about one hard year." I kept my voice gentle, even as the words landed with finality. "This is about a marriage where I quietly disappeared a little more every year, and you let me, because it was convenient. Because an invisible husband doesn't ask questions, doesn't need credit, doesn't get in the way of a promotion." She sank back down onto the kitchen stool, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by something closer to real fear. "So what happens now?" I thought about Serafina's hand in mine at the gala, steady and warm. I thought about the locket, restored and gleaming, sitting in a velvet box on my workbench. I thought about 10 years of a promise I'd buried because I believed it was gone forever, only to find it had simply been waiting. "I don't know exactly what happens with Serafina yet," I said honestly, "but I know what happens with us, Lyra. I think we both know." She didn't argue. For the first time all night, she just cried quietly, and I stood there in our kitchen, feeling the strange, hollow relief of finally saying a truth I'd been swallowing for years. By Monday morning, Lyra had clearly decided that grief and pleading weren't working, so she switched strategies entirely. I found out because Serafina called me at 11 a.m., her voice carrying a tightness I hadn't heard from her before. "Can you come to the office?" she said. "Now, if possible." Lyra requested an emergency meeting with the board, and she's brought her own set of accusations. I drove to Marchetti and Hale's headquarters, a glass tower downtown that Lyra had always described with a kind of reverent pride, like the building itself validated every choice she'd made in life. I'd never actually set foot inside it before. Walking through the lobby now, past the gleaming reception desk and the wall of framed design awards, I understood a little better why my quiet workshop had never impressed her. Serafina met me at the elevator and walked with me to a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, where Lyra was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by a lawyer I didn't recognize. 3 board members sat along one side, including the silver-haired founding partner from the Gala. Everyone's expression was carefully neutral, in the specific way of people bracing for a fight. "Thank you all for coming," Lyra said, her voice steady now, composed, all traces of Saturday night's tears erased. She'd clearly spent the weekend rebuilding her armor. "I want to address the accusations made at Saturday's gala directly, because I think there's important context that's being left out." She turned to me. "Julian and I have been having serious marital difficulties for months. He's been distant, resentful of my success, and, frankly, unstable. I think what happened Saturday was less about intellectual property and more about a man trying to publicly humiliate his wife using a relationship with our CEO that, frankly, raises its own questions." She glanced at Serafina. "I have reason to believe that relationship extends well beyond professional interest, and I think the board deserves to know that before taking any of these claims seriously." I felt my jaw tighten, but Serafina, beside me, didn't so much as blink. "And if this board doesn't take my concerns seriously," Lyra continued, her voice sharpening, "I have personal correspondence, emails between Julian and Ms. Sterling that paint a very different picture than the one being presented here. Emails that suggest this entire situation was orchestrated to damage my reputation and elevate an affair into something that looks like corporate justice." The threat landed exactly the way she wanted it to. I saw 2 of the board members exchange uneasy glances. Reputational scandal was the one thing that made powerful people nervous faster than anything else, and Lyra knew it. "Those emails don't exist," I said quietly. "Serafina and I have exchanged maybe a dozen messages total, all about restoring a locket and scheduling the gala. If you have altered correspondence, Lyra, that's not evidence. That's fabrication." "We'll let the media decide what's credible," Lyra said coolly, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that she meant it. She was prepared to manufacture a scandal and let it play out publicly if it meant salvaging her career. Serafina finally spoke, and her voice, when it came, was quiet in a way that somehow filled the entire room. "Lyra, before you go any further with threats you can't actually follow through on, I think it's time the board saw the full picture, not just the sketches from Saturday." She nodded to her assistant, who'd been standing near the door, and a folder was placed on the table. Serafina opened it and slid several documents toward the board members. "These are time-stamped digital records from Julian's design software, showing the Halcyon estate concepts in development 18 months before Lyra's presentation to this board. Metadata doesn't lie, even when sketchbooks might be dismissed as coincidence." She turned another page. "And this is a formal statement from Julian, filed with legal counsel this morning, documenting unauthorized use of unregistered intellectual property, his intellectual property, used to secure Lyra's promotion and this year's departmental bonus structure." The room went very still. "As for the alleged emails," Serafina continued, unbothered, "I'd encourage the board to request the originals through proper legal channels rather than accepting selectively edited screenshots. I have nothing to hide, and neither does Julian. But fabricating evidence to threaten a company's leadership is a very different legal matter than a marriage falling apart, Lyra. and I suspect your lawyer already knows that." Lyra's attorney, sitting beside her, had gone slightly pale, glancing sideways at his client with an expression that suggested this was the first he was hearing about fabricated correspondence. The founding partner closed the folder in front of him with a quiet, final sound. "Lyra, I think it's best we adjourn this meeting and continue our internal review, effective immediately, of the Halcyon Project's origins. Given what's been presented today, I'd also strongly advise you reconsider any further threats involving fabricated material. That's not a negotiation. That's a warning." Lyra sat frozen at the head of the table, her carefully constructed defense collapsing for the second time in 3 days, this time in a room full of the very people whose respect she'd spent her entire career chasing. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. Mostly, I just felt tired, and quietly certain that whatever remained of my marriage had just been buried, permanently, under a stack of time-stamped files on a conference room table. A few days after the meeting at Marchetti and Hale, Serafina asked me to come with her to Belhaven, the small coastal town where we'd both studied art more than a decade ago. "I need to see it again," she said over the phone, her voice quieter than I'd heard it since she first walked into my workshop. "With you there this time. Properly." We drove up together on a grey Thursday morning, the ocean visible in flashes between the hills, and I felt the strange, layered sensation of retracing a path I'd once walked as a completely different person. Belhaven hadn't changed much. The same narrow cobblestone streets, the same weathered fishing boats bobbing in the harbour, the same little art academy building perched on the cliffside, its windows catching the pale morning light. Serafina was quiet for most of the drive, and when we finally parked near the old boardwalk and stepped out into the salt-heavy wind, I could see something shift across her face. Not confusion this time, but recognition, deep and aching. "I remember the smell," she said softly, closing her eyes for a moment. "I didn't know I remembered it until right now." We walked along the boardwalk together, past the small cafe where we used to spend entire Sunday afternoons sketching strangers over cheap coffee, past the gallery that had given us both our very first exhibition space as broke 23-year-olds who believed, with the particular arrogance of the young, that we were going to change something in the world together. "This is where you asked me," she said suddenly, stopping in front of a weathered wooden railing overlooking the water. "Isn't it? I can almost—" She pressed her fingers to her temple, the way she did when a memory was surfacing but hadn't fully arrived yet. "There was a promise. Something about building a life around this, around making things that mattered, together." "You remember that?" I asked quietly. "Pieces of it, enough to know it was real." She turned to face me fully, the wind pulling strands of dark hair loose around her face. "I've spent 10 years building a career I'm proud of, Julian. But there's always been this absence, a shape in my life I could never quite explain. I used to think it was just restlessness. Now I understand it was you." I felt the pull of everything we'd lost rushing back at once. 10 years of grief I'd carefully packed away. 10 years of believing this exact conversation would never happen. Standing there with her, in the place where we'd first promised each other a future, it would have been so easy to simply say yes. Let's pick up exactly where we left off, pretend the decade in between hadn't happened at all. But that wasn't fair to her. And it wasn't fair to me either. "Serafina," I said carefully, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to actually hear it, not just the part where I say I still love you. Because I do. That part hasn't changed since I was 23 years old." She waited, watching me with the same patient, steady attention she'd given me in my workshop 3 weeks ago, back when she hadn't known who I was yet. "I'm still legally married," I continued. "I know it's over. I've known it's over for years, honestly. Longer than I want to admit. But it's not actually finished yet. And I don't want to build something new with you while something old is still technically unresolved. You deserve better than being the reason I finally left, instead of the reason I finally healed enough to be ready for something real." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the water, and I braced myself for disappointment, for impatience, for some version of the frustration I'd grown used to from Lyra whenever I didn't move fast enough for her expectations. Instead, Serafina reached over and took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine, slow and deliberate. "Do you know what I appreciate most about you, even now, remembering only pieces of who we used to be?" she said. "You've never once tried to rush me into anything. Not the gala, not the sketches, not this." She gestured between us. "You're being careful with something that matters to you. I recognized that in you the very first day I walked into your workshop, before I even remembered your name." "So you're not upset?" "I'm not going anywhere, Julian." A small, genuine smile crossed her face, the first one I'd seen since we'd arrived in Belhaven. "I waited 10 years without even knowing I was waiting. I can wait a little longer while you finish closing one door properly, so we can open the next one without anything following us through it." We stood together at that railing for a long time after that, watching the tide roll in against the rocks below, not saying much of anything else. It didn't need to be said. For the first time since Serafina had walked back into my life, holding that tarnished silver locket, I felt something settle inside me that wasn't grief, and wasn't longing, and wasn't fear of losing her again. It was patience, the kind that comes from finally trusting that some things, once truly meant, find their way back to you, even after 10 years of silence. As long as you're willing to do the difficult, unglamorous work of actually being ready for them. 2 weeks after Belhaven, I sat in a conference room that felt deliberately smaller and colder than the one at Marchetti and Hale, waiting for Lyra and her attorney to arrive for the divorce proceedings. My own lawyer, a calm, methodical woman named Priya Anand, sat beside me organizing a folder of documents she'd already reviewed a dozen times. "She's had 2 weeks to think this through," Priya said quietly, glancing at her watch. "My guess is she comes in fighting or comes in defeated. There won't be much in between with someone like her." She was right, though not in the way either of us expected. Lyra walked in exactly on time, dressed simply, none of the polish and armor she'd worn to the gala or the board meeting. Her attorney followed behind her, carrying a thin folder that suggested he already understood there wasn't much left to negotiate. The board's internal review had concluded the week before, quietly, without a public statement, but with consequences severe enough that Lyra's promotion had been formally rescinded, and her position at Marchetti and Hale reduced to something she'd once have considered beneath her. She sat down across from me without meeting my eyes at first. "Let's begin," Priya said, opening her folder. "The terms are straightforward. Given the nature of the assets involved and the timeline of the marriage, we've proposed an equitable division that accounts for—" "I'm not going to fight it," Lyra said quietly, cutting her off. Her attorney glanced at her, clearly surprised. "Lyra, we discussed—" "I'm not fighting it," she repeated, finally looking up at me. "I read through everything you sent over, Julian. The settlement's fair, more than fair, honestly, considering everything." The room went quiet for a moment. I'd expected resistance, negotiation, maybe even one last attempt to guilt me into softening the terms. Instead, I watched something in her finally crack open. Not performance this time, not a calculated pivot to vulnerability designed to get something from me. Just exhaustion, and underneath it, something that looked almost like honesty. "Can I say something?" she asked, glancing between the two lawyers. "Not for the record, just before we sign." Priya looked at me, and I nodded slightly. "Go ahead," I said. Lyra folded her hands on the table, staring down at them for a long moment before speaking. "I've had 2 weeks to sit with everything that's happened. Losing the promotion, losing my position on the Halcyon project entirely, watching people at the office look at me differently now, like I'm someone who got caught rather than someone who earned what I have." She let out a shaky breath. "And somewhere in all of that, I finally let myself actually think about you. Not what you could do for me, not whether you were useful to my career or embarrassing at a dinner party. Just you, actually, as a person I used to genuinely love." Her eyes were wet now, but she wasn't performing for an audience the way she had at the gala. There was no crowd here to manipulate, no board to convince. Just the two of us, and the quiet end of 6 years. "I spent so long being ambitious that I stopped noticing when ambition turned into using people," she continued. I told myself I was building something for us. But if I'm honest, I stopped thinking about us a long time ago. I was building something for me, and you were just supposed to stand quietly in the background and support it, no matter what it cost you. She wiped her eyes quickly, almost angrily, like she was frustrated at her own tears. I took your work, Julian. Not just once. I've been quietly pulling from your old sketchbooks for years, small things here and there, telling myself it didn't count because you never used them anyway. I don't think I ever really let myself see that as stealing until it blew up in front of 300 people. Lyra, let me finish, she said softly. I'm not saying this so you'll feel sorry for me, or so you'll change your mind. I know this is over, and honestly, it should be. I just needed to say, out loud, that I know exactly what I did. To your work, to our marriage, to you. She looked up, meeting my eyes fully for what felt like the first time in years. You supported me quietly for 6 years, and I mistook your patience for weakness instead of what it actually was. I undervalued you completely, Julian, and I don't think I understood how badly until I watched you walk into that ballroom with someone who actually sees you. I didn't say anything for a long moment. There wasn't triumph in hearing it, the way I might have expected weeks ago. Just a quiet, sad kind of closure. Thank you for saying that, I finally said. I mean it. She nodded, wiping her eyes one final time, and reached for the pen Priya slid across the table. Her hand shook slightly as she signed each page, and when she finished, she set the pen down and looked at me with something that resembled genuine peace, maybe for the first time since I'd known her. I hope you're happy, Julian, she said quietly. I really do. You deserve to be, more than I ever let you believe. I signed my own copies a few minutes later, and just like that, 6 years of marriage ended not with the explosive scandal of the Gala, but with something quieter, sadder, and infinitely more honest. 2 people finally telling each other the truth, right at the exact moment it stopped being able to change anything between them. A month after the divorce was finalized, I stood in an empty industrial space on the edge of the arts district, sunlight pouring through a wall of tall factory windows, watching Serafina walk slowly through the room with a clipboard in hand, mentally mapping out a future neither of us could have imagined a season earlier. This is it, she said, turning to me, a smile breaking across her face. This is exactly the space I pictured. We'd spent the past 3 weeks searching for the right location, and this one, a converted warehouse with soaring ceilings, exposed brick, and enough natural light to make any restorer weep with joy, had finally felt right. It would become the headquarters of the Sterling Voss Foundation for Historic Arts, the organization Serafina and I had begun building together almost immediately after my divorce was finalized, though the idea itself had taken root back in Belhaven, on that windswept boardwalk overlooking the water. The mission was simple, even if the work wouldn't be: preserving historical art and architecture that private collectors and corporations had let quietly decay, while also funding grants for independent restorers and artists who, like me for most of my career, worked in obscurity without institutional support or recognition. I keep thinking about how many pieces get lost simply because nobody with resources cares enough to save them, Serafina said, running her hand along a section of exposed brick wall. Beautiful things, disappearing not from disaster, but from neglect. That's what we're going to change here. I understood that mission on a level she couldn't fully appreciate. Not yet. I'd spent 15 years watching gorgeous, irreplaceable objects come through my workshop from people who'd inherited them and simply didn't know or care what they had. Antique furniture stripped for parts, paintings left to mildew in damp basements, jewelry melted down for scrap value because nobody bothered to have it appraised first. Every single time, some small part of me had grieved quietly, wishing there was a way to intervene before the damage became irreversible. Now, finally, there was. Over the following weeks, the space slowly transformed. We hired a small team, an architectural historian, 2 junior restorers eager to learn techniques that had nearly died out in an age of mass production. a grants coordinator who'd spent years frustrated watching larger institutions overlook smaller, more meaningful preservation projects in favor of flashier acquisitions. Serafina brought the operational expertise and business acumen that a decade of running Marchetti and Hale had sharpened into something formidable. I brought the hands-on knowledge, the years of technical restoration experience that no business degree could replicate. Working alongside her every day was unlike anything I'd experienced in my marriage to Lyra. There was no hierarchy of whose career mattered more, no quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface, no sense that my contributions were somehow less valuable because they didn't come with a corporate title attached. When I offered an opinion on a restoration approach, Serafina listened, genuinely considered it, and more often than not, deferred to my expertise without ego. When she pushed back on a decision, it came from genuine collaboration, not control. One afternoon, several weeks into setting up the foundation, I found her in the corner office we'd designated as hers, staring at a photograph pinned to the corkboard behind her desk, an old picture I hadn't seen in years, one I didn't even know still existed. It was the two of us, 23 years old, standing on the Belhaven boardwalk, paint-stained and grinning, arms slung around each other like the whole world was still ahead of us and nothing could possibly go wrong. "Where did you find that?" I asked. "My mother had it," she said softly, not turning around. She kept a box of things from before the accident, things she never showed me because she thought they'd upset me. After everything that's happened, I finally asked her for it. She traced the edge of the photograph gently with one finger. "I look at this, and I don't just see memory anymore. I see continuity. Like we didn't actually lose 10 years. We just took the long way back to exactly where we were always supposed to end up." I crossed the office and stood behind her, resting my hands gently on her shoulders as she leaned back into me, both of us quiet for a long moment, looking at two younger versions of ourselves who had no idea what was coming. The accident, the amnesia, the decade of separate lives, the marriage that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty. They didn't know any of it yet. They just knew they loved each other and wanted to build something meaningful together. "We're finally doing it," I said quietly. "What we promised each other back then. It just took a little longer than we planned." Serafina turned in her chair to look up at me, her eyes bright with an emotion I recognized instantly, because I felt the exact same thing settling warm and steady in my own chest. "Some promises are worth waiting a decade for," she said, "especially the ones that come back to find you exactly when you're finally ready to keep them properly." Outside the office windows, late afternoon light spilled across the newly renovated workshop floor below, where our small team was carefully cataloguing the foundation's first acquisition, a badly damaged 18th century writing desk, rescued just days earlier from a demolition site, waiting patiently to be restored to something whole again. Not unlike the two of us, I thought, waiting patiently for exactly the right hands to finally put the pieces back together. 6 months after we first walked through the doors of that empty warehouse, the Sterling Voss Foundation for Historic Arts held its opening exhibition on a crisp autumn evening overlooking the very same stretch of coastline where Serafina and I had first fallen in love as art students, and where, more than a decade later, we'd finally found our way back to each other. We'd chosen the location deliberately, a renovated gallery space built into the cliffside just outside Belhaven, close enough to the old academy that former classmates and professors could attend, close enough to the boardwalk that I could see the exact railing where Serafina had first remembered our promise, still standing exactly where we'd left it. The gallery was full that evening, warm light spilling out through tall windows onto the terrace, where guests mingled with champagne glasses and admired the foundation's first completed restoration projects, displayed proudly throughout the space. The 18th century writing desk we'd rescued months earlier stood centerpiece in the main hall, fully restored, its wood gleaming, its brass fittings polished back to life. Beside it hung a series of paintings we'd saved from a collapsing estate, each one a testament to exactly the kind of quiet, patient work I'd dedicated my entire career to, finally given the recognition and resources it deserved. I stood near the edge of the terrace for a moment, watching it all unfold, and felt something unexpected settle over me. Not just pride, but a kind of disbelief that this was actually my life now. 6 months ago, I'd been a man invited to his wife's promotion gala as an afterthought, expected to sit quietly at a back table and stay out of the way. Tonight, I stood as co-founder of an institution that mattered, surrounded by people who valued exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous work I'd once believed nobody would ever fully appreciate. Lyra hadn't been invited, obviously, though I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd left Marchetti and Hale entirely a few weeks after our divorce was finalized, taking a smaller position at a different firm across the city, one where nobody knew her history, and she could, presumably, start rebuilding a reputation from the ground up. I didn't wish her ill. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't feel much of anything toward her anymore beyond a distant, faded sadness for the years we'd both wasted misunderstanding what we actually needed from each other. "You look like you're somewhere else entirely," Serafina said, appearing beside me on the terrace, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. She passed one to me, her emerald dress catching the last of the sunset spilling across the water. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I said, accepting the glass. "From your office to here." "From further back than that," she corrected gently, following my gaze out toward the darkening water. "From right down there, actually." She nodded toward the boardwalk below, barely visible now in the fading light. "I still remember the exact moment you asked me to build a life with you. It took me 10 years and a car accident to forget it, and about 3 weeks to remember it completely once you were standing in front of me again." I turned to look at her fully, and something in her expression told me she had more to say. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into the small clutch at her side. She withdrew a small velvet box. The same one, I realized with a jolt, that had held the tarnished silver locket the very first day she'd walked into my workshop. "You already gave that back to me," I said, confused as she opened it. Inside wasn't the locket. It was a ring, simple, elegant, clearly chosen with the same careful intention she brought to everything she did. "I know we agreed to take this slowly," she said, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. "And I meant that, every word of it. But I've spent 10 years without you because of circumstances neither of us could control. I don't want to spend one more day pretending I'm not completely certain about what I want next." She held the box out toward me. "Marry me, Julian. Properly this time. Let's finish the promise we started on that boardwalk down there, all those years ago." I looked down at the ring, then out at the darkening water, then back at her, at the woman who had walked into my workshop as a stranger and walked out, weeks later, as the person I'd loved my entire adult life, restored to me in fragments and then completely. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion I didn't bother hiding. "Of course, yes." The small crowd nearby, drawn by the moment unfolding on the terrace, broke into quiet applause as I slid the ring onto her finger, and Serafina laughed through unexpected tears, pulling me into an embrace that felt like the closing of one long, difficult chapter and the opening of an entirely new one. Behind us, through the gallery windows, I could see our first exhibition glowing warmly against the night, restored treasures that had once been forgotten, neglected, nearly lost forever, now standing whole again under careful new light. It felt like more than a coincidence. It felt like exactly what we'd built our entire foundation around. The belief that even the most damaged things, given enough patience and the right hands, could be brought back to something whole. Hand in hand, no longer burdened by forgotten memories or old betrayals, Serafina and I turned away from the water and walked back into the gallery together, stepping forward into a future built not on convenience or obligation, but on a promise, finally, fully kept.